My cousin Delia called me a gold digger with my grandfather's ashes still on the mantel behind her head. She said it to a room full of family, in the living room of the house where I'd spent the last 2 years learning how a person dies slowly and with grace, and she said it with the confidence of someone who has already decided how a story ends. Then the notary, a quiet man named Mr. Adler, who had been setting up a small speaker on the coffee table, cleared his throat, and said that before he read a single line of the will, my grandfather had left instructions that the family was to watch something first. He picked up a remote. The old television flickered on, and my grandfather's face, alive and wry and 8 months younger than the day he died, filled the screen of his own living room. He looked directly into the camera, and the first thing he said, before hello, before anything, was, "I'd put money on the fact that somebody in that room has already called Nora a gold digger." So let's start there. Welcome back to Quiet Defender Stories. I'm Nora Bell, 30, and for 2 years I was the only person in my family who showed up, which is a thing you don't get credit for until a dead man decides to give it to you on video. If you've ever been accused of the exact opposite of who you are by people who never once looked closely enough to know the difference, stay with me and tap subscribe, because what my grandfather said next, on that television, in that room, is something I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. I have to take you back before I take you forward, because the accusation only makes sense if you understand how little these people knew. My grandfather was Emmett Reed. I called him Pop, the way I had since I was old enough to talk, because my own father, his son, left when I was 6, and Pop stepped into the hole he left without ever once making it feel like a favor. He was a big, quiet man who'd spent 40 years as a machinist, with hands like worn leather and an old workshop out back that smelled like sawdust and motor oil, and he believed, more than any person I've ever met, that you could tell everything about somebody by watching what they did when they thought no one was keeping score. There were a lot of us Reeds, spread across the county, and most of them treated Pop like a holiday. They'd appear at Thanksgiving and Christmas, loud and affectionate for exactly as long as the meal lasted, and then they'd scatter back into their own lives for 11 months, and Pop would wave them off from the porch and come back inside and do the dishes alone. My cousins Chase and Delia were the worst of it, not because they were cruel exactly, but because they'd inherited the family talent for treating warmth like a performance you only put on when there was an audience. Chase was 34, and always between ventures, always about to close on something big. Delia was 32 and had married a man with a boat and never let anyone forget it. And behind them, orchestrating in her quiet way, was their mother, my Aunt Marilyn, Pop's daughter, who loved her father the way you love a bank you assume will always be open. I was different, and I'll be honest that I didn't set out to be. I just liked him. I liked the workshop and the quiet, and the way he'd hand me a piece of sandpaper without a word, and we'd work side by side for an hour before either of us said anything worth saying. Every Sunday for most of my adult life, I drove the 40 minutes out to Pop's, and we worked on the truck. That's the thing you need to hold on to, because it comes back around. A 1966 Ford F-100, powder blue, that Pop had bought the year he married my grandmother, and that had been sitting dead in his garage under a tarp since before I was born. When I was 22 and going through the worst year of my life, he'd pulled the tarp off it one Sunday and said, "This thing's been waiting long enough, let's bring it back." And for 8 years, one Sunday at a time, we did. New brake lines, rebuilt the carburetor. He taught me to do the bodywork myself, taught me to feel when a bolt was about to strip, taught me patience by making me redo things I'd rushed. That truck was where he raised me. Really. Not the dinners. The Sundays. Then, 2 years ago, Pop got sick. It started small, the way it does, and then it wasn't small anymore, and there came a Sunday when I drove out and found he'd fallen in the kitchen and been on the floor for 2 hours because he was too stubborn to wear the alert button we'd bought him, and I made a decision that afternoon that I never once reconsidered and never once mentioned to the rest of the family, because it wasn't their business and I didn't want a committee. I gave up my apartment, and I moved into Pop's house, into the little back bedroom, and I became the person who was there. Not a nurse, not at first, just there. I drove him to appointments. I learned to read his pill bottles and his moods. I cooked soft food when the chemo made everything taste like metal. I sat with him through the nights when the pain wouldn't let him sleep, and we'd watch old westerns on that same television until the sun came up. I kept my job, remote, working from his kitchen table, and I spent every other waking hour keeping a proud man's life from collapsing in on itself, and I want to tell you plainly, because it matters to what my cousin said, that I never once asked him for a single thing. Here is where I have to tell you about the lie, because Pop told a lie 2 years ago that changed everything, and I didn't understand it until I was watching him explain it from beyond the grave. About a month after I moved in, Pop gathered the family. A rare thing, a called meeting, everyone summoned to the house on a Sunday, and he sat them all down in that living room, and he told them, in a heavy, careful voice, that he had bad news. He said the investments he'd been counting on for his retirement had gone bad. A bad bet. A company that folded. A financial advisor who turned out to be a crook. He said the medical bills were mounting and the money he thought he had wasn't there, and that he was probably going to have to sell the house, and that things were going to be tight, and that he might, in the months to come, need help. Real help. Money, time, care. He said he hated to ask, but he was asking. And then he looked around the room at his children and grandchildren, and he waited to see what they'd say. I was in the kitchen. I heard the whole thing through the doorway, and I heard, in real time, the temperature of my family drop to freezing. Oh, they were sympathetic in the moment. Lots of that's awful, Pop, and we'll figure it out. But I watched what happened after, and after is where people tell the truth. The Sunday visits, which had never been frequent, stopped almost entirely. Chase, who'd called Pop weekly when he thought there was money to be inherited, suddenly got very busy with a new venture in another state. Delia sent a fruit basket and a text about how she wished she could do more, but the boat payments, you understand. Aunt Marilyn came by twice in 6 months, both times to subtly ask whether Pop had considered which of his things were worth anything, quote, before they got lost in the shuffle of a sale. The family that had circled Pop like he was a warm fire quietly decided the fire was going out, and they went to find a warmer one. Within 3 months of Pop announcing he was broke, I was the only one who ever came. And I didn't come more because of the announcement. I came exactly as much as I always had, which was all the time, because I lived there, because I loved him, because the money had never once been the reason, and so the news that it was gone changed nothing about a single thing I did. And I'd forgotten I'd done this until I heard him mention it on the tape, I even offered him my own savings once, a not large but not nothing amount I'd been putting aside for a house of my own, and I told him it was his if the bills got bad, and he'd patted my hand and said no, sweetheart, but thank you, and changed the subject. I never thought about it again. I was about to find out he'd thought about it every day. Pop died on a Tuesday in the spring, in his own bed, with me holding his hand, and his last words to me were about the truck. He said, "Don't let them sell the Ford, Nora, whatever happens." And I said I wouldn't, and I didn't understand yet why he'd say that, why the truck of all things, and then he was gone, and for a week I didn't think about anything except the size of the hole. The family reappeared for the funeral, of course, loud and affectionate, back on stage, and I watched them at the reception scanning the house, and I understood, the way you understand something you're too tired to fight, that the story had already been written in their heads, and I was the villain in it. The granddaughter who'd moved in with the sick old man, who'd isolated him, who'd wormed her way into a dying man's house and, they assumed, his will. Chase actually said to me, at the funeral, with a sympathy that had a hook in it, it must have been so convenient, living here rent-free all this time, and I was too gutted to even answer him. If you've ever been recast as the schemer by people who couldn't be bothered to show up, drop a comment, because I promise you my grandfather saw all of it coming, and he did something about it. Stay with me. This is where it turns. The will was to be read a week after the funeral, in Pop's living room, because Pop had specifically instructed it be done there, and not in an office. All of us gathered. Chase and Delia and Aunt Marilyn, and a scattering of other Reeds, and me, sitting slightly apart, the way I'd learned to sit at every family gathering my whole life. And there was a tension in the room that was really about one question, the only question any of them cared about, which was how much, and to whom. They'd spent the week, I could tell, reassuring one another that whatever the old man had left, it should go to blood that mattered, to the real family, and not to the girl who'd been living off him. Mr. Adler, the notary, arrived precisely on time, a slight silver-haired man with a soft voice and a leather folder, and as he was setting up, before he'd read a word, Delia decided she couldn't wait, and she looked across the room at me, And she said it. The thing they'd all been thinking, dressed up as concern for the family. She said, "I just think we should all go into this being honest about what's been happening here. Nora moved in on a vulnerable old man and cut the rest of us off, and if this will says what I think it's going to say, then we all know exactly what she is. A gold digger." She said the word cleanly, like she'd been saving it. And that is the moment Mr. Adler cleared his throat and said the will would wait, because Mr. Reed had left instructions that the family watch a recording first, and he turned on the television, and there was Pop. The room made a sound when his face appeared, a collective intake. He was sitting right there, in the chair he was buried out of, filmed in that very room maybe 8 months before he died, wearing his good flannel, and the sight of him alive and looking straight at us knocked the smugness clean off every face in that room, including mine, because I hadn't known this existed and I was suddenly, unbearably, hearing his voice again. "If you're watching this," Pop said, "then I'm gone, and Adler's done his job, and you're all sitting in my living room, wondering what you're getting, so let's not waste each other's time." He had his reading glasses pushed up on his head. He looked comfortable, unhurried, a man who'd thought this through. "First thing, I'd put money on the fact that somebody in that room has already called Nora a gold digger, probably before Adler even got his coat off. So let's start there, because I want to be looking you in the eye when we do." I watched Delia go very still. "2 years ago," Pop said, "I called this family together, and I told you I'd lost my money, that the investments went bad, that I might have to sell the house, that I was going to need help." He paused, and something came into his face that I can only describe as the patience of a man who has already forgiven you and is disappointed anyway. That wasn't true. I want to say that plainly so there's no confusion. It was a lie. I made it up. Every word. There was no bad investment. There was no crooked advisor. My money was exactly where it had always been, which is to say, there was a good deal more of it than any of you ever knew. He let that sit. On the screen, he almost smiled. I lied to my own family about being broke, and I did it on purpose, and I want to tell you why. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the clock in the hall. "I'm an old machinist," Pop said. "I spent 40 years learning that you can't tell if a part is any good by looking at it when it's sitting on the shelf. You have to put it under load. You have to run it hard and see what holds and what cracks." And I realized, somewhere in my 80s, that I had no idea which of the people who called me family were the good part, and which ones were just waiting on the shelf for me to die. You were all so warm at Christmas. But warm at Christmas costs nothing. I wanted to know who you were under load, so I put you under load. I told you the money was gone, and then I sat back, and I watched to see who I was to you when there was nothing left to get. I looked around the room, and I watched it land on them one by one, watched the calculations start behind their eyes, watched them realize that the recording was a mirror, and they were not going to like what was in it. "Chase," Pop said, and my cousin flinched at his own name coming out of a dead man's mouth. "You called me every week for a year, when you thought I had something to leave you. You wanted my opinion on your ventures, which meant you wanted my money for your ventures. Within a month of me saying I was broke, you moved to Arizona, and I heard from you twice in 2 years, and both times it was a text on my birthday that I'm fairly sure had a reminder set for it. He wasn't cruel about it. That was the terrible part. He said it like a man reading a measurement off a caliper. Just the number. Delia, you sent a fruit basket. You told me your heart was breaking that you couldn't do more, and then you posted pictures from a vacation 2 weeks later that cost more than a year of the help I said I needed. I'm not angry, sweetheart. I'm just telling you what the gauge read." Delia's face had gone the color of paper. "Marilyn," Pop said, softer, because she was his daughter, and even this had love in it. "You came twice, and both times you asked me what my things were worth. My own daughter, sizing up the estate of a man she'd been told was dying broke. I kept hoping the next visit you'd just sit with me. You never did." He took his glasses off his head and set them down, and he looked, for a moment, tired. "I need you all to understand. I'm not doing this to punish you. I loved every one of you, and I still do, from wherever I am now. I'm doing this because a man's got a right to know the truth before he decides where his life's work goes, and you only get the truth when people don't know they're being watched." And then Pop looked into the camera, and his whole face changed. the way it used to when he'd look up from a bolt and find me standing in the workshop doorway, and he said, "And then there was Nora." I don't have good words for what it's like to hear someone you've buried say your name with love. I'd been holding myself together in that room for a week, being the villain in everyone's story, and Pop said my name from the television, and I felt something in my chest give way. "Nora didn't change," Pop said. "That's the whole thing. That's all you need to know about her. I told her I was broke, same as I told the rest of you, and she didn't come around more, and she didn't come around less, because the money was never once why she came. She'd already given up her apartment. She was already sleeping in the back room. She was already driving me to every appointment and learning my medications better than the nurses, and sitting up with me through the bad nights watching John Wayne movies till the sun came up. And when I told her the money was gone, you know what she did?" He shook his head slowly, like he still couldn't believe it. "She offered me her savings. The girl who had the least of any of you offered me the most. She told me the money she'd been saving for her own house was mine, if the bills got bad. She meant it. She'd have handed me every dollar she had for a man she thought couldn't pay her back a cent." He paused. "That's not a gold digger. I don't know what you call the opposite of a gold digger, but whatever it is, that's what was sitting in my kitchen for 2 years, while the rest of you were checking the internet for my obituary." Chase started to say something, and Mr. Adler, without looking up, simply raised one finger, and Pop kept talking, because you cannot interrupt the dead. If you've ever watched the truth walk into a room that was ready to lie about you, hit like, because the next part is the part I didn't see coming either, and it's the reason my grandfather made me promise about the truck. "So here's what happens to my money," Pop said, and the room leaned in despite itself, because even now, even caught, they wanted the number. And I've done this the careful way, on purpose, with Adler and a lawyer, and my own doctor all on record that I was sharp as a tack the day I signed. Because I know exactly what some of you are already thinking about contesting, and I want to save you the legal fees. This recording is part of the file. A judge can watch it. I planned for that too. I was a machinist. We measure twice. I saw Aunt Marilyn's mouth close. "To Chase and to Delia," Pop said, "I'm leaving $20,000 each. And before you decide how to feel about that, I want you to know it's not a punishment, and it's not nothing. It's exactly what I'd have left you if you'd been honest and distant, which you were. You were honest, in your way. You showed me you'd scatter the second there was nothing to get, and I believe people when they show me who they are. Take the 20,000 and I hope it does you some good, and I hope someday you figure out that the reason you didn't get more isn't that Nora took it, it's that you left." He said it gently. There was no venom in it. It was so much worse than venom. It was accuracy. "To Marilyn," he said, "I'm leaving the lake cabin and $100,000, because you're my daughter, and because 2 visits in 6 months is a failure, but it isn't a stranger, and because your mother would want you looked after, even when you don't deserve it, and maybe especially then." I watched my aunt begin to cry, and I couldn't tell if it was grief or shame or the cabin. "And the rest," Pop said, and here he looked straight into the camera again, straight at me, though he couldn't have known exactly where I'd be sitting, and somehow it felt like he did. "The house, the workshop, the accounts, which are a good deal larger than this family ever suspected, because I lived like a machinist and invested like one too, quiet and patient, and for the long haul, all of it goes to Nora." The room erupted, and Mr. Adler raised his finger again, and Pop's recorded voice rode right over the noise the way he must have known it would. "Not because she earned it, though she did. Not as wages, though God knows if I'd paid her by the hour for 2 years, I'd owe her the house anyway. I'm leaving it to her, because she is the only person in this family who ever loved me for free, and a man ought to give what he's built to the person who'd have stood by him if he'd had nothing to give. She proved she'd have taken me broke, so she gets me rich. That's not a reward, that's just justice, run through slow and careful the way I run everything." I was crying openly now, and I didn't care who saw. And then Pop said the thing that undid me completely. He said, "Nora, the truck's yours, obviously, but I made Adler put it in special, separate from everything else, because I need you to understand what it is. It was never about the truck, sweetheart. You know that. It was about the Sundays. 8 years of Sundays. You gave an old man his best day of every week for 8 years, and never once knew you were doing it. That truck is every hour you sat in that garage with me when you could have been anywhere else. It's the only thing I own that's actually worth what I'm leaving you, and it's the one thing this family will never understand the value of, which is exactly why it's the one I most want you to have. Drive it. Don't let it sit under a tarp like I did for 30 years, waiting for the right time. There is no right time. There's just the Sundays you show up for. You taught me that. A man learns it late. He smiled. That whole warm, crooked smile. Now go finish the bodywork on the passenger door. I know you've been putting it off. I laughed, this awful wet broken laugh. Because it was true. I had been putting it off. And he knew. Of course he knew. He knew everything. The recording ended a moment later. Pop said, "That's all. Be kind to each other," which I realize is rich coming from a man who just faked being broke for 2 years to catch you all out. But do it anyway. Life's short. I found that out. Goodbye. And Nora, I love you, kid. And the screen went dark, and the room sat in a silence so total it had weight, and my grandfather was gone all over again. Here is what I want you to understand about what happened next, because it's the part that separates my grandfather's kind of justice from the cheap kind. Nobody screamed. There was no brawl. The reckoning had already happened. Quietly, completely, on a television, in the words of a man none of them could argue with, because you cannot argue with the dead, and you cannot argue with a caliper. Chase stood up and left without a word, his ears red. Delia sat there with her mouth working, trying to find the version of this where she was still the wronged party, and not finding it, because Pop had closed every exit before he ever pressed record. Aunt Marilyn came over to me, eventually, and she didn't apologize, not really, but she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "He was right, and that was more than I expected, and I let it be enough." And here is the choice I had, the same choice Pop spent my whole childhood teaching me to make, the choice between the cheap satisfaction and the real one. I had, in that moment, the entire moral high ground and a room full of people who had just been proven wrong about me in front of the whole family. I could have said the thing. I could have looked at Delia and said the word gold digger back to her. The room would have allowed it. Pop had earned it for me. I didn't. Not because I'm a saint, but because Pop wasn't cruel even when he was being exact, and I wanted to be my grandfather's granddaughter more than I wanted to win. So I stood up, and I said, to the whole room, quietly, "He loved all of you. You heard him say it. He wasn't doing this to hurt you. He was doing it because he couldn't stand to leave without the truth being said once, out loud, in the open." And then I said the only hard thing I let myself say, and I said it gently, the way he would have. If any of you want to come back, if any of you want to actually know me instead of the version you invented, the door's open. It always was. That's the part you never checked. Delia left. Most of them left. But my cousin Chase's daughter, a quiet 9-year-old named Ruby, who'd been sitting forgotten in the corner through the whole thing, came up to me before they dragged her out, and she said, "Was that really Grandpa Emmett on the TV?" And I said it was, and she said, "I liked him. He showed me the truck once," and I knelt down and I said, "Do you want to come see the truck sometime, and help me finish it?" And her whole face lit up, and I understood that Pop Sundays didn't have to end with Pop. That maybe the most Reed thing I could do, the most Pop thing, was to pull the tarp off something for a kid going through her own hard year, and hand her a piece of sandpaper, and not say anything for a while. I finished the bodywork on the passenger door that summer. It took me 3 Sundays. I did it slow, the way he taught me, and I redid the part I rushed, because I could hear him telling me to. The powder blue Ford runs now, really runs, and I drive it into town on Sunday mornings with the windows down, and old men in the diner parking lot nod at it because they remember Emmett Reed, and I let them tell me stories about him I've never heard. I still live in his house. I never sold it, never will. The accounts turned out to be even larger than the family feared, and I've done with them what I think he'd have wanted, which is quiet and patient and mostly invisible. I set up a fund at the community center for kids who need a workshop, and a person who'll sit with them without keeping score. I didn't put his name on it. He'd have hated that. He believed the best thing you build is the thing nobody knows you built. Ruby comes out most Sundays now. Her dad, my cousin Chase, took the $20,000 and never spoke to me again, but he lets Ruby come, which is either grace or convenience, and I've decided not to look too hard at which, because the girl needs the garage more than I need to know Chase's reasons. She's better with a wrench than I was at her age. Last week she felt a bolt about to strip and stopped before it went. And I didn't teach her that. She just felt it. And I had to go inside for a minute, because it was so exactly the thing Pop used to praise me for. People ask me if I felt vindicated, watching that recording, watching my family learn in real time exactly how wrong they'd been about me. And the honest answer is the same one I keep coming back to. It wasn't triumph. It was grief with the volume turned all the way up, because the one person who ever saw me clearly had to die, and reach out from the other side of it, just to say so out loud. And I would trade every account and every acre, and the truck itself for one more ordinary Sunday in that garage with him not saying anything. But he left me the truth on purpose, in a room that was ready to bury it, and I've come to understand that was his last and best lesson. You don't have to defend yourself to people who've already decided who you are. You just have to be who you are, quietly, for long enough, in front of the one person patient enough to keep score the right way. The measurement holds. It always holds. People show you exactly who they are, the moment they think nothing's left to get. My grandfather bet 2 years and his whole fortune on that truth, and he was right, and he made sure the gauge got read out loud. If you've ever been called the opposite of who you are by people who never once bothered to look, take this as your reminder that you don't owe them the argument. Live the truth long enough and it records itself. Somebody's always keeping the real score, and it's never the loud ones in the room. If this reached the part of you that's still being blamed for showing up, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me about the person who saw you clearly when no one else did. And subscribe, because the next story's already warming up in the garage. I'll see you in the next one.